3:42 a.m., Strait of Hormuz. A U.S. guided missile destroyer cuts through dark, narrow water, its radar quietly tracking dozens of small contacts drifting near the Iranian coastline. On the bridge, it looks routine. Tankers moving in and out, civilian traffic, a few Iranian fast boats lingering, just like they always do. Nothing unusual. Then one of them breaks formation. Engines surge, 40 knots, straight toward the destroyer. No warning, no radio call. Just a fast-moving dot on the radar, closing distance. They were wrong. Because what looks like another harassment maneuver is now less than 6 minutes away from triggering something far bigger than a naval incident. Inside that narrow stretch of water, over 20% of the world's oil supply is moving through a corridor barely 21 miles wide. One mistake here does not stay local. It detonates globally. And yet this is not even the real danger. Because while the world watches these boats, something far more dangerous is happening behind closed doors in Tehran. A power struggle. A system breaking from the inside. A military force that no longer answers to its own government. This is the story of how Iran did not just challenge the United States at sea, but may have already lost control of itself before the first shot is even fired. At 3:43 and 12 seconds a.m., that radar picture did not just show a single fast boat. It showed a pattern. 12 more small contacts began shifting position along the Iranian coastline. Not random, not drifting. Coordinated. Each one moving just enough to stay outside immediate engagement range, but close enough to form a loose arc around the shipping lane. This was not harassment. This was shaping the battlefield. U.S. analysts had seen this before. The IRGC Navy does not fight like a traditional fleet. It fights like a swarm. Fast attack craft, light hulls, heavy weapons, thousands of them. Some carry anti-ship missiles, others carry mines. Some are nothing more than bait. And in waters this narrow, speed matters more than armor. The Strait of Hormuz is only 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. In some sections, usable shipping lanes shrink to just 2 miles across. That means reaction time is measured in minutes, sometimes seconds. Above the surface, it looks chaotic. Underneath, it is calculated. Satellite feeds coming out of the region over the past 72 hours had already flagged unusual activity. Over 3,000 small IRGC vessels repositioned along key choke points. Shore-based missile batteries quietly activated. UAV traffic increased by 40%. At the same time, something else changed. Command authority. Interceptions picked up a shift in communication patterns inside Iran's military structure. Orders were no longer flowing through the traditional civilian channel. They were bypassing them, going straight from IRGC command nodes to field units. No delay, no oversight. In Washington, that detail mattered more than the boats, because it meant one thing. The people controlling the trigger might not be the same people sitting at the negotiation table, and that changes everything. For years, the assumption was simple. Iran would escalate, but it would stay within a predictable framework. Pressure, then negotiation. Threats, then de-escalation. But now, that pattern was breaking. In the past 10 days alone, Iran had lost billions in oil revenue. Ports were slowing to a halt. Storage facilities were filling to capacity. Analysts estimated that within 2 weeks, Iran could be forced to shut down parts of its own oil production. That is not pressure. That is a countdown. And inside Tehran, two completely different strategies were colliding. The civilian leadership was trying to keep the system alive. The IRGC was willing to risk everything, even if it meant turning Hormuz into a battlefield. Even if it meant dragging the United States into direct confrontation. Back on that destroyer, none of this was visible. What they saw was a cluster of small boats. What they did not see was a system losing internal control, pushing every piece on the board forward at the same time. And once that happens, mistakes are no longer accidents. They become inevitabilities. Somewhere inside the command chain, a single word had already been sent. Execute. 3:44 a.m. Distance 1.5 miles. That is no longer a buffer. That is a trigger. On the bridge, every eye locked forward. No one spoke. No one needed to. The Iranian lead boat was no longer probing. It was committing. Engines pushed to maximum, hull slamming against the water, wake cutting straight toward the destroyer's bow. Behind it, 5 more contacts surged at once. Not scattered, aligned. Closing fast. Inside the combat center, targets lit up one by one, heat signatures rising, speed profiles spiking beyond normal patrol behavior. This was not random movement. This was an attack profile forming in real time. Weapon status shifted instantly. Phalanx tracking active. Missile systems armed. Target priority assigned. A final warning was transmitted across open channel. Silence. No response. Distance 1 mile. At that range, a single missile launch changes everything. Impact time under 30 seconds. No margin for hesitation. The captain gave the order. Stand by to engage. Finger on the trigger. Every system locked. And then the screen glitched. A sharp burst of interference cut across the radar. Not long enough to blind it, just long enough to disrupt it. Signal distortion. Brief, precise, deliberate. Inside the combat center, one word moved through the room. Jamming. Now it was clear. This was not just a surface approach. This was layered. Boats in front, electronic pressure behind, testing reactions, timing responses, mapping the system. The Iranian lead boat crossed under 1 mile. 800 meters. 700. Still accelerating, still silent. This was no longer brinkmanship. This was seconds from lethal force. The phalanx locked center mass. Auto-tracking engaged. If that trigger is pulled, the result is immediate. 6,000 rounds per minute. Nothing survives that envelope. 600 meters. 500. And then, it happened. The boat did not slow. It did not signal. It did not hesitate. At 400 meters, it cut hard across the destroyer's path. Close enough to feel the wake. Close enough to be a collision if timed differently by less than a second. A calculated near impact. Not a mistake. A message. Or a warning. Behind it, the formation broke instantly. Engines dropped, vectors scattered, every contact pulling back toward Iranian waters as if a switch had been flipped. No shots fired. No explosion. But everyone on that ship knew the truth. They had just crossed the line. Not physically, but operationally. Because this was not a failed attack. This was a full systems test. Reaction time. Weapon readiness. Electronic response. Rules of engagement. Everything had just been measured. And now both sides had the data. Back in Washington, that mattered more than a missile strike. Because next time, there would be no reason to turn away. By 5:10 a.m., this was no longer about one destroyer. It was about the region. In Washington, the data from that encounter had already been processed, reviewed, and escalated through multiple command layers. The conclusion was simple. This was not harassment. This was preparation. And the response began immediately. Within hours, U.S. Central Command shifted posture across the entire Gulf. Surveillance assets increased, recon flights doubled, satellite tasking reprioritized over the strait. Nothing public, but everything moving. At Al Udeid Air Base, crews were already preparing aircraft that do not get prepped for routine patrols. EA-18G Growlers. Electronic warfare platforms designed to do one thing: shut systems down. At the same time, A-10 Strike aircraft were placed on rapid standby. Their mission profiles adjusted for fast attack craft interdiction. Low altitude. High precision. Minimal warning. Further out, naval groups began repositioning. Not dramatically, just enough. To tighten angles, to shorten response windows, to remove uncertainty. Because the real concern was no longer what had happened. It was what had been learned. That near collision had exposed reaction times down to the second. It had revealed how long U.S. systems take to lock, to track, to decide. And now that data was in the hands of the IRGC, which meant the next move would not be a test. It would be optimized. Meanwhile, inside Iran, the situation was moving in a completely different direction. Civilian officials were pushing for de-escalation. Signals were being sent quietly through diplomatic channels. Attempts to stabilize oil flow. Attempts to avoid collapse. But those signals were not controlling the field. The IRGC was. Intercepted communications showed continued deployment along the strait. More boats. More drones. More activity around coastal missile batteries. No pullback. No pause. Two strategies. One trying to stop the fall, the other accelerating it. And in the middle of that split, something dangerous was taking shape. Because for the first time, U.S. planners were no longer modeling a limited response. They were modeling a first strike. Not symbolic. Not restrained. Decisive. Target sets were updated. Coastal radar arrays. Fast boat staging areas. Command nodes tied to IRGC naval operations. Assets were matched. Timelines calculated. Windows identified. If the order came, the opening phase would not last hours. It would last minutes. Electronic suppression first. Blind the radar. Cut communications. Then precision strikes. Take out the boats before they leave harbor. Take out the systems before they activate. Control the strait before it closes. On paper, it was clean. In reality, it was irreversible. Because once that sequence starts, there is no contained version of it. Iran responds. The region reacts. Markets spike. Shipping halts. And the narrow stretch of water that carries a fifth of the world's oil turns into a battlefield overnight. Back on that destroyer, the sea was calm again. Traffic resumed. Radar steady. Routine restored. But everyone on board knew something had shifted. They had seen how close it could get. And now, both sides were moving pieces into place for what comes next. Not if, when.